Greetings from the Iranian Studies Unit of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. My name is Mehran Kamraval. As we speak today, Iran, the United States, and the European powers are in Vienna to continue negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. The nuclear program of Islamic Republic has had a long history and has significant domestic repercussions and dimensions. We're joined today by Dr. Rouzbeh Parsi, who will discuss Iran's nuclear program and its domestic repercussions. Professor Parsi is the head of the Middle East and North Africa program of the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Previously, he was senior lecturer in human rights and history at the Human Rights Program at Lund University in Sweden. This was a program that he founded himself. From 2009 to 2013, before joining Lund University, he was a senior research fellow at the European University Institute for Security Studies in Paris, focusing on Iran and the Gulf states. Dr. Parsi has published extensively. His published works include Iran and the West, Regional Interests and Global Controversies, a book that he edited in 2011. And in 2012, he edited a book called Iran, a Revolutionary Republic in Transition. His latest publication is a study that is called So Close Yet So Far: Facilitating Dialogue and Cooperation Across the Persian Gulf, a study that he co-wrote with Dr. Dina Esfandiari in 2020. Thank you, Rouzbeh, for joining us today as part of our Iranian Studies Unit lecture series. Before we begin, I'd like to remind the audience to submit questions via the Q&A feature on Zoom or by commenting on the live streaming post of the event at the Arab Center's social media platform. Rouzbeh has kindly agreed to take some questions after his talk. And so without further ado, Rouzbeh, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mehran, and thank you to the unit and the center for the kind invitation. I very much look forward to the questions. Usually that's what keeps me on my toes, so I really look forward to that. So let me give you a very brief overview of where this all started, and more importantly then, where it has gotten Iran today. I think it's important to be reminded that the Iranian idea of nuclear power goes back to the monarchy, it goes back to the Shah, and it was part of his constant attempt to prove to the world and to the Iranian society as such that Iran was no longer a third world country. Iran was an aspiring first world country, if you will, and it was using its oil money, it's fairly not newfound, but at least in many ways, the kind of quantum leap in revenue that you had in the 1970s for good use, and that it would soon be a par with countries like France. And in this, of course, in all of the things that you can do, aspiring to become part of the first world, nuclear power was then, if not science fiction, then at least one of the most prestigious technology investments and ambitions that you could possibly have. And at that point, of course, Iran, being a solid ally of the Western camp during the Cold War, had really no problem with acquiring, or at least signing contracts for buying wholesale nuclear power stations from both France and the United States. Now, all of that, of course, came to naught because of the revolution, but by that point, Iran did not have a functioning nuclear power station. It had a research reactor in Tehran, which is still active, but it did not produce nuclear power, nor did it enrich. And enrichment was, in a sense, beyond buying the package of nuclear power. Enrichment means that you master the whole fuel cycle. You master the way of producing the very fuel that you need. And through that, you know basically and have industrial capacity for everything that goes with nuclear power. And then when I say nuclear power, I mean not only nuclear power, but I also mean nuclear weapon power. That is the ability to enrich to a few percent in order to create the fuel for a nuclear power station gives you the knowledge and know-how in principle to continue that enriching until you reach 90%, at which point you have weapons grade uranium or plutonium. So the story, in a sense, begins long before the Islamic Republic comes into being. What, of course, happens is that this idea of enrichment and independence is also fused with the kind of solitary feeling of being left to your own devices that comes with having alienated just about everyone. And this is, of course, something that most revolutionary powers do. They tell everyone around them that they have a very new idea of how to organize society and politics, and that everything everyone else has been doing is obsolete. And in doing so, of course, they alienate the neighbors and all the global powers and so on and so forth. So the idea of prestige, the idea of general independence is then fused with this sense of being left to your own devices during the 8-year-long war with Iraq, at which point, of course, nuclear power is the least of the concerns of Iran. But it is an idea that comes back later in the 1990s. Now, at some point, the program is then resuscitated. And now, to some degree, with the help of North Korea, which by definition also means that there is some kind of weapons dimension, at least as something on the horizon of a potential. And this does not necessarily need to be something that's operationalized, but the fact that one insists on trying to have enrichment on your own soil means that you learn to master the fuel cycle, and that opens the door for such a development later on. Now, all of this might have seemed fairly simple at the beginning, but like many of these projects, they kind of take a life of their own, and the repercussions are beyond what anyone could possibly have computed as a potential scenario. This happens with many state projects that run for decades, but in this particular case, we can say that it has had a devastating effect in many ways on how Iran has developed as a country and has developed as a society. Now, you can argue, and people do, whether the pros or the cons of having had this program to this extent has been to the detriment or the advantage of Iran. And this is a kind of an adjudication that will never cease, because it depends on when you put the stop sign down. In 5 years' time, maybe if things have gone well, all of this might look like something that was worth it. At the moment, I would at least say that in many ways, it has been a very, very costly project where the outcome so far has been quite meager. It becomes much more of a problem and much more of something that defines Iran, both outside of the country and increasingly to some degree inside the country when we reach the 2000s. In 2002, there is a supposed discovery that Iran has a nuclear program, which was known to many of the Western powers, but it was made into a kind of an official truth now. And from then on, Iran has one way or another been at loggerheads with, if you will, the permanent five of the UN Security Council, who also happen to be the only kind of official nuclear weapon states of the world. And in this kind of logjam, it's been negotiating to what extent its program is legitimate and to what extent enrichment is something that the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Iran is a signatory to, is allowed or not. And from now on, those negotiations also become part of Iranian domestic politicking, as in it is being used by various factions as a way of both showing what they think is a proper foreign policy or a failure of their opponents in their foreign policy. And it becomes a litmus test to what extent one can have a relationship with the Western world. We have to remember that this is happening at the same time as Iran is increasingly becoming a post-revolutionary society. Not necessarily a post-revolutionary state, so that can be argued as well, but more importantly, a post-revolutionary society. This is a country with a very young population, which has doubled since the revolution, which means that when we reach the 2000s, a fair amount of the people alive do not remember the revolution, even less so now. Most of them weren't even born at that point. So their understanding of life in the Islamic Republic is very different from those who, in a sense, can compare with what it was before the Islamic Republic existed. So this is also the societal backdrop in which this nuclear program becomes an issue which Iran cannot avoid. That is, those who want it out of the way in order to have foreign policy on other issues still have to get it out of the way. And then there are those who, in a sense, define their foreign policy through the nuclear program, not because of the program itself necessarily, but because the program gives them a particular position vis-a-vis the world. It gives them something to show that they are not only defiant in a revolutionary sense, but they are defiant and successful. They have a nuclear program. It's not a slogan, it exists. It thrives despite all the attempts from the outside world to sanction or in any way hamper the program. And in that respect, one can say that the program has been successful. It has survived despite all the odds at a huge cost economically and more importantly, politically. But it does exist. Iran does enrich on its own soil, and it has increasingly advanced centrifuges through which it can enrich. So if that is a criteria for success, you can say that it has succeeded. But then you have to ask yourself, what was the point of the program? Because if the point of a program is simply to defy the world and define your own rules for what you are allowed to do, then it has been very, very costly. It has cost, the cost is in the billions of dollars in terms of the program itself, but it is even higher in billions of dollars in terms of what Iran has not been able to do because of the sanctions that the program has brought on it. So if you think of it as part of a societal progression, this is a technology we master in order to progress as a society, I would say it has so far not managed to really prove itself. Now, the other aspect of this, of course, is that through President Ahmadinejad in particular, we can see that the program then becomes not only a prestige project with the outside world, it becomes a thing inside Iranian body politics. And because he makes so much hay out of it, even when he himself realizes that he needs to negotiate the way out of this cul-de-sac that Iran has ended up in, this dead end, as it were, it is difficult for him to do so because he has invested so much prestige in this program that any kind of compromise looks like a sellout. So that's one problem, and that is a problem that Iran to some degree still grapples with. The other problem, of course, is that Iran has a political system that is full of factional strife. So the issue isn't necessarily that no one wants to negotiate. The issue is rather, we want to negotiate to succeed. We don't want the other factions to succeed. And so some of the limbo in which Iran ends up in the 2000s is not that it does not recognize the need to negotiate, not even necessarily that it does not recognize where the compromise must lay, but because the ones who are doing the negotiations, the ones who are conducting the negotiations, have been sabotaging the previous administration's attempts at negotiation, and now it's payback time. So it becomes part of the domestic political football at huge cost for the country as such. But again, that shows you that a political system like the Iranian one, and it's not in any way unique in this, tends to be very introverted and very much concentrating on positioning and bickering, and only really shores itself up and rises to the occasion when it is facing a systemic crisis. So in that sense, whatever consensus there is on this program and how far it can go on and to what extent it's worth its price comes more when it is faced with outside immediate threats, like the threat from the Bush administration to maybe, if Iraq was successful, to move on to Iran, then you can see that some idea of a cohesive course direction is being devised, because at that point, it no longer is political football inside family. It is about whether the family will survive at all. So in that sense, Ahmadinejad's years were domestically and in terms of foreign policy, very wasteful years. Not only did his economic policy domestically fail, but also his attempts to create political capital that in a currency that was worth it in international terms failed. His defiance, as it were, on all kinds of issues, including ones that were utterly bizarre, like his questioning of the Holocaust, were things that basically just put Iran beyond the pale. And you can see that the serial failure of his administration to navigate international waters is what ended up making the Iranian program more than a headache for the International Atomic Energy Agency, but rather make it a political issue and a political headache for the UN Security Council. And by having the issue transferred there, it became much more complicated to negotiate the technical aspects of it, because now it was purely a political animal. And it has remained so since then. And yet, despite everything I've said now, which is very much doom and gloom, somehow in 2013 to 2015, there were real serious negotiations that actually did end up with a solution to the Iranian enrichment program. And so we have to ask ourselves, how was that possible? What made that possible? And I think this is a crucial aspect, not just for this case study, but because it tells us something about, if you will, the method through which issues like this can be solved, or at least brought to a level that is manageable. And this is something that people now tend to forget, because everyone is writing the obituary of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is the formal name of the agreement that was reached in July 2015. The reason why the negotiations succeeded, and the reason why the negotiations were serious, was because everyone had to take a very hard look at what was their own strengths and how much they had overestimated the weaknesses of the counterparts. Now, some people will write this history and say, we negotiated with Iran since 2003, basically, and in 2013, it bore fruit. I would claim that is a narrative of continuity that does not bear scrutiny. That is, after 2005, there were no serious negotiations. During the Ahmadinejad years, they negotiated about which city to sit in order to negotiate, more than actually negotiating the substance of the issue. But what happened was that as the Obama administration was reaching its second administration, and all the sanctions that the Obama administration very successfully and skillfully had tailored towards trying to strangle the Iranian economy, was bearing fruit in the sense that it had effect, but was not bearing fruit for the ambition, which was to make Iran cave in, as it were, on its nuclear program. It was therefore not effective. So it had an effect, but it was not effective. And so the Obama administration understood that their prerequisite for negotiations, which was zero enrichment, was not going to work, because there was nothing they could do short of war that would bring Iran to the table if that was the outset of negotiations. And instead, they had to think about it the other way around. They were to aim for zero enrichment at the end of negotiations, not as a prerequisite for having them. And on the Iranian side, the supreme leader, in the waning days, the winter days of Ahmadinejad's administration, realized that this particular issue, if compartmentalized, needed to be solved with the Americans, because otherwise the Iranian economy and polity could not develop in the way that they all knew that they needed. And this has remained the albatross around the neck of the supreme leader. If he wants to muddle through economically, he can live under sanctions. But if he wants the kind of economic prosperity that leads to social stability, he needs to have these sanctions removed or mitigated one way or another. Not because he intends to trade with the United States directly, not because he likes the Europeans, very few in the Iranian political system do nowadays, but because if all of that is still there, trading with the Chinese and the Russians, which is everyone's hope, says more about their hope than it says about the Russians and the Chinese, all of that is going to be more costly and more difficult. Still doable, but more costly. So they both, in a sense, came into the negotiation room willing and able to understand that they are not as strong as they thought and that the counterpart isn't as weak as they would like. And still, it took 2 years for them to negotiate, but they did reach a conclusion. They managed to sign an agreement which worked. And what everyone thought at the time, I used to go to Vienna now and then to try and follow the negotiations. What everyone on this side, of course, thought, and this side, I mean the Western side, was that the problem was that Iran might renege, that the Iranians were not reliable. And in the end, the irony, if you will, was what those of us who had less rosy picture of the American political system were afraid of, which is that the United States would renege, because the political support and the political health of the American system was not as good as saying that what is once signed is going to be honored. And so in the sense, the economic incentives that Iran needed and made it sign the deal did not have time to bear fruit before there was a change in administration. And while everyone was afraid that a Clinton administration would be tougher on Iran, no one imagined what would happen if Donald Trump won, and he did. And in May 2018, he left the deal. And by then, there wasn't much left of the deal anyways, for the simple reason that, like Hamlet, he went to Twitter and thought out loud about his doubts about this particular agreement. And since the American commitment to the agreement was based on presidential waivers, a president voicing his doubts about the point of an agreement on Twitter meant that no one could trust that those waivers would continue to be signed. And therefore, trade with Iran did not develop anywhere near the volume that everyone was hoping for in order to steady the deal politically in Tehran and continue to give it support. And so when Trump left the deal, it existed as it does today, but it exists roughly in the same way as the Oslo peace process. It's there on paper, everyone needs it to be there, but no one believes that it is actually alive. It is at the moment, to some degree, a fiction. And 1 year after Trump left, during that year, Iran, in a sense, tried patiently to wait for the Europeans to step up and fill the void that Trump had left. And since the Europeans could not do that, would not do that, Iran then decided to go on its own pressure campaign and instead started to enrich more and deviate from the agreement. And so that's where we are now. Both one has left and the other one has deviated so far from its commitments that no one really believes that it is doing what it needs to do. And they're now negotiating about how to get one of them back into the deal formally and how to get the other one to stop deviating and complying with what they have signed. And they are not getting anywhere. And there are several reasons for this, but I think one is important to mention, or actually there are two. One is that what Trump did destroyed the political position of those who said that we could have a functioning agreement with the United States in Iran. To argue for that in Iran today is a fool's errand because you really have nothing to show for it. And that means that everyone else who might be wrong 99% of the time, but can guess the time of day once per day correct, feel vindicated, even though in a sense it is not fair strategically to claim that they are. And the other problem, of course, is that the Biden administration seems to have forgotten what the Obama administration learned, which is that this is not going to be solved solely by pressure, because the Iranians are, if not immune, at least by now immunized to some degree against the pressure that the United States levies against it. And instead of quickly getting back into the deal and from inside pressure Iran to comply fully, the Biden administration dragged its feet, which made the transition from the government in Iran that negotiated the deal to a much more hardline government who is now trying to negotiate with much less experience and with much more rigid positions, a point where no one really knows if the deal is salvageable and what could then replace it if it is not. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rouzbeh. That was excellent and perfect and incisive and in-depth discussion of the history and some of the complexities surrounding the negotiations. A couple of questions, and before we go to questions that have come in, you very perceptively point or raise the question of whether or not the nuclear program has been worth it for Iran in terms of scientific accomplishments, in terms of the costs and the benefits. Is that question at all asked within policy circles inside the country?
I would say that it was. It was being asked, not in the sense of 0 or 1, not as in we shouldn't have had it at all, but the question, should we really pursue it to this length at any cost? I'm not so sure that that question is as easy to ask today. And that is, of course, because of the fact that they did compromise. They were willing to have it confined and constricted through the agreement in exchange for economic opening towards the world. And they didn't get that. So now asking the question whether we should have pursued it to this length becomes a bit moot, for the simple reason is that the other side reneged. Iran did what it was supposed to do. So I think it's still a legitimate question, but I think politically it is a much more difficult question to pose in Tehran.
That's right. In fact, this reminds me of a conversation I had in Tehran. Someone was saying it's not necessarily about nuclear program. If Iran were to manufacture shoestrings, somehow the United States and its allies, Israel and others, would come up with what an existential threat to global peace and security shoestrings are that Iran is manufacturing. And some of the actions and the rhetoric coming out of Western capitals has unfortunately vindicated that line of thinking.
Absolutely.
As you mentioned.
I mean, I usually, when I worked for the EU, I would remind people because, you know, the EU's official position was that we had 2 tracks with Iran. So one is the nuclear and one is everything else, or it's human rights, or so in a sense, trying to constantly reiterate that we are not, you know, a cyclopic view. There's only one thing we are obsessed with. But in the end, all conversations and all the oxygen in the room went to the nuclear issue. And it reminded me of the supposed saying of a French revolutionary statesman during the French Revolution, where he said, states have armies, but in Prussia, the army has a state. And in this case, you ended up in a situation analytically, and I think many people still live in that delusion, that Iran is not a country with a nuclear program. It's a nuclear program with a country. And in that sense, everything is interpreted and everything is channeled through that tunnel, which is a very, very distorted view of a very complex political system and society.
Right, right. Thank you. A couple of questions have come from social media, if I may ask. One says, what role have Iraqi political parties that are loyal to Iran played in Iran's nuclear program and its enrichment? Do you have any thoughts on that?
My spontaneous reaction would be none, but they played a role in the sense of Iran's regional position, because that was the corollary, right? So we solved the nuclear issue, and then everyone thought we can get Iran to compromise on its regional positions and its influence in Iraq and Syria and so on. I don't think that necessarily ever was in the cards, but the point is that we never got to try properly if the nuclear agreement, as the Iranian foreign minister once said, is the floor rather than the ceiling. That is the nuclear agreement the height of potential agreement with Iran, or is it a stepping stone towards other kinds of agreements? That remained an unresolved issue because there was no time before the Trump administration came in and just kind of turned the clock back.
Thank you. Another question asks what the Iranian public's current view is on the present administration reviving the nuclear deal.
That's a good question. I haven't seen any polls that are official on that issue. I know that if you look in the last 10 years, you can see also from when the agreement was reached that there was a huge outburst of enthusiasm because irrespective of what people thought about the nuclear program and its legitimacy or not, et cetera, the point was that they could see that the sanctions that came with the program not being legitimized internationally meant that they suffered as people. That is, in their wallets, in society in general, they could see they bore the costs of this issue remaining in the eye of everyone without any resolution. So I think in that sense, everyone in Iran probably would want it resolved. But then, of course, the question is how much of a compromise are they willing to accept? The economic cost of the sanctions that Trump levied on Iran, even more than the ones that Obama did, and which are still in place in total during the Biden administration, have had a huge detrimental effect on the Iranian economy. The impoverishment of the middle class, the number of people living on the poverty line, has increased tremendously in the last 3 years. So in that sense, there is a kind of a quantum leap in what society has to bear because this issue remains unresolved.
Thank you. So following up on that, we know that the Iranian public has historically been among the most pro-American of publics in the Middle East. And in particular, American soft power has been quite a pervasive force in Iran. Has that been diminished somewhat as a result of the Trump administration's policies, or does the Iranian public really blame the Iranian government for much of the predicament, if not all of it, in which it finds itself?
Well, I think, first of all, the interesting thing perhaps is that in general, the Iranian public is more sophisticated than the American public, which tends to conflate population and government. So I think many in Iran very much enjoy American soft power, irrespective of what they think of the American government. And I think this is also something that has been a thorn in the side of the Islamic Republic from its very inception. Hence the attempt to create its own internet, to try one way or another to marginalize all the channels through which American movies and culture come into Iran. But I think that's a losing battle and has been for a long time. If nothing else, it also shows to some degree the difference of generation between the older generation who still run the ship, so to speak, and the younger ones. Now, Iran has a much more sophisticated media landscape now and much more money spent on creating its own TV series, etc., as a way of trying to counter all of that American production. I'm not so sure that it's very effective necessarily. I think it maybe caters to those constituencies who are inclined to be sympathetic to the government line to begin with. So in that sense, it reinforces that particular constituency, but I'm not sure that it is enlarging that constituency. So I think in that sense, the Iranian government and the Iranian system is getting a lot of the blame for what is happening, and to some degree, rightly so. But at the same time, I think there is also constituencies who see that it doesn't really matter who is running the ship in Tehran. They're not getting anywhere with the United States in particular. And to some degree, at least, that is also because of how the American system is developing. And I think that's, if I may add, I mean, that's also one of the reasons why the negotiations are difficult. Who knows if Biden can stand for re-election in 2024? There's absolutely nothing that says that he would win. And if it is a Republican at this point, it looks very much like it's going to be Trump again. And if it's not Trump, it's going to be someone like Mike Pompeo. So in that sense, the United States would go back to that very, very confrontational and dangerous kind of militaristic line on Iran. And so what would be the point of reaching an agreement now that can stand basically 2 years at best?
Perfect, thank you. Another question says, Dear Rouzbeh, you argued that Iran's case is not unique. when discussing the historical background and referring to domestic football. What other cases do you have in mind, or for sake of comparison?
Well, I mean, you can think of it several ways. I mean, first of all, if we're thinking Iran and enrichment, what we're dealing with is what's called the threshold state. So these are states that have the technological know-how, the science community, and the industrial capacity to start enriching in general, and then who could then enrich theoretically and quite practically all the way up to weapons grade. Now, there are a number of, I mean, Sweden had and can do that. Japan is another famous case. So there are a number of countries. You're counting up to 30, 40 countries in the world who technologically could, if they wanted to, go down that path. So in that sense, one of the good arguments, if you will, for the agreement was that it could set a new gold standard for the kind of restrictions and inspections that countries who are threshold and are not willing to take a step back from the threshold would have to accept if they are inside the non-proliferation treaty. But you know, that is now a hypothetical. So that is one of the things. The other thing is, of course, that in the Iranian case, like in many other cases, what we see is that you create a science community. You get a community of scientists and engineers whose careers and knowledge is invested in this field. And therefore, if you were to scrap it wholesale, you also have to deal with the headache of what are you going to do with all these people? This is a problem that, for instance, the United States and a lot of the world had after the collapse of the Soviet Union. All of those, hundreds of nuclear scientists who had had careers within the Soviet nuclear program, where were they going to go? Who was going to hire them and to do what? So these are issues that both create inertia in a system, that you kind of keep things going because you also have an internal constituency specifically for these kind of programs. But also, if you were to dissolve it wholesale, what are you going to do with all these people to make sure that their knowledge stays within confines that you find acceptable?
Perfect, thank you. Another question, what is the Gulf states' position on the Vienna talks? And what explains the recent engagement with Iran?
That's a very good question. I think there are several ways of disentangling that. I would say that the official, if you go back to the negotiations for the original deal, the official position of countries like Saudi Arabia was that why don't we have a seat at the table? Because we are concerned with the program, though of course that actually probably meant we're concerned with Iran's position in the region. Where the program just happens to be the reason why the Russians and the Chinese and everyone else could agree on dragging Iran to the table, as it were, and chastising it into confining it. The counter argument, if you will, was exactly that the reason for the success of the negotiations then was the compartmentalization of all the issues. The Russians and the Chinese were not necessarily interested in discussing or negotiating regional issues with the Americans and the Iranians and the Saudis and the Israelis. What everyone could agree on was the primary fear that could induce all of them to sit down together was that this enrichment program should not have a weapons dimension. And so by checking all the other beefs that they had with each other at the door, they managed to solve this singular issue. The hope being that it could open the doors for further negotiations, which of course did not happen for various reasons. I think now the official position of many countries in the Gulf is that they want to have a seat at the table. But at the same time, you can see through the engagement they're having bilaterally with Iran, that they're also realizing some other truths that have been difficult to swallow. One of them is that even though Trump was very much anti-Iran, if you will, and therefore pro-Gulf states confronting Iran one way or another, he was only doing it as a transactional actor. He was never going to stand next to Mohammed bin Salman. He was going to stand behind him, and he was going to ask for a check, literally, for everything the US did. So that's one issue. The other issue is that Trump, for all his deficits, and there are too many to enumerate, knew one thing, that the American heartland did not want another war in the Middle East, not interested at all. That had been one of his most successful lines against the establishment opponent he had, who was Hillary Clinton. So he was not going to get himself involved into anything that looked like a proper war in this region for the sake of saving whichever country who claimed to be a long-standing ally of the US, because he doesn't care about alliances, he cares about transactions. So in a sense, I think countries like Saudi Arabia also realized that whatever they could count on from the US, it was never going to be enough to solve their issues with Iran. So at some point, they were going to have to deal with that directly themselves, because the Iranians, if they want to show deterrence and ramp up pressure, weren't going to wholesale attack American positions, but going to attack American allies' positions, which they fairly effectively and dramatically and theatrically did in 2017, 18, and 19. So that kind of induces you to kind of take control, take the reins of some of these things rather than wait for a cue from Washington. And I think that's good, not necessarily how it came about, but it's good because it means that people also understand that whatever security arrangements or detente this region can muster has to have domestic, regional support, buy-in, and be conceived there rather than be imposed by a global power from the outside. Perfect,
thank you. Rouzbeh, this next question is from my good friend, Professor Manucher Doraj. Manucher asks that it seems that the United States and its allies may be willing to abandon Iran or abandon the idea of incorporating Iran into the global economy and relegate it to another North Korea. What's your take on that?
I think there are definitely those in DC who would like that, because they would consider that to be a continuation of the containment policy of the 1990s, if you will. But I think those who argue that in DC as a viable policy, that says more about the bubble of DC that they live in than the real world. I think without overstating the Iranian case, there is also a historical trajectory that we need to keep in mind. To put it very bluntly, the Western world, whatever you want to call it, the transatlantic connection, has dominated the world for the last 500 years. But for all the millennia before that, this was an Asian world. It was China and it was the Asian landmass. It wasn't the European end of it, so to speak. And I think what we're looking at now is a return to that shift in where things are happening, where things are being produced. So that means that the idea that you sitting in the US can maintain the kind of global system that you built in the last 50 years, being the dominant world power, to use it to create North Koreas here and there, totally ignores the fact that economic power and economic channels and infrastructure is no longer yours to control. I think if you even talk to the people who are the most driven in being enthusiastic about sanctioning Iran and just about any country in the world, levying American economic power, control of WTO, et cetera, they will tell you that it should be used very conservatively, because what happens is that you saturate and you immunize your target, one, and second, you incentivize them to create parallel channels, parallel worlds where their economic activity can take place. And I think what Trump did by doing it in everyone's face, much more than how subtly Obama did, was to show the Chinese that they cannot be, for instance, allowing themselves to have their economic system controlled by a banking consortium placed in a stamp-sized country called Belgium. This is SWIFT, which is the system everyone's bank uses to transfer money. That's an open standard. You can create your own. And why shouldn't you, if another sovereign state is levying that particular system to force you to not trade with country X? So I think in that sense, China and the others, their attempts to create their own more sovereign, less US-controlled economic channels and systems has been accelerated by the Trump administration. It would have happened anyways, but it's happening quicker. And that means that making Iran into North Korea is going to be much more difficult. And in fact, if it was to succeed, also requires the Iranian political elite to play along, either willingly or simply out of stupidity.
Thank you. A couple more questions, if I may. This one involves another astute observer of Iran, Trita Parsi, your brother. Do you think the coma scenario that Trita Parsi recently depicted is feasible? There's a comparison here with the Oslo process, which you alluded to earlier. What do you think about that?
Yes, but what is the difference? And here we come to the crucial difference between the Oslo process, if we're going to make that comparison. And that is the fact that the Palestinians have very little, if any, power. So for Israel to contain them in these kind of open encampments, as Gaza is, and continue just taking up land and continue having this kind of dominance is possible. And since no outside power has the political capital or the will, more importantly, or interest in trying to kind of weigh up and balance Israeli dominance, the comatose patient is useful for everyone who needs the political fiction that there is a process still around, without actually having to invest anything in it or sacrifice anything for it. In the Iranian case, if Iran continues to enrich to 60%, I doubt very much that countries like Israel or the United States, for that matter, are going to be able to kind of ignore that in order to avoid worse situations, because we then also assume that everyone in the US and Israel think that war is a bad option. I don't trust politicians anywhere enough to kind of complacently hope that they realize that war usually is the worst option.
Thank you. Well, this leads to the next question. There are actually two questions, and I'll combine them. One has to do with the American threat that says if diplomacy fails, there are other options. And the other question related has to deal with the feasibility of the Israeli threat to attack Iran's nuclear facilities. Can you comment on those?
Yes, and I have to say, I'm become increasingly depressed having to comment on them, because, you know, if you've been in the business long enough as you have and I have, you know that this isn't the first or even necessarily the second time that this whole circus of Washington, D.C. policy options come up. I even wrote an article 10 years ago arguing against someone who then was enthusiastic about bombing Iran. So bombing Iran seems to be something that people can, you know, they can wake up without having to read a single line of anything and come up with this option. Now, you could say I could be a pacifist and therefore I'm against war, and that's the reason I'm not a pacifist, but that's not the reason why this is a bad option. It's a bad option for several very clear, realistic reasons. One, the Pentagon conducted a study 10 years ago itself and came to the conclusion that if it was to bomb Iran's nuclear program, it could destroy it, but then it would be roughly rebuilt within 2 to 3 years. And if it hadn't a weapons component before, it would guarantee to be having a weapons component after. Why? A very simple reason. We've had a number of nuclear enrichment and nuclear potential weapons or actual weapons program in the world. One was Saddam Hussein's, one was Muhammad Gaddafi's, one is Iran's, and one is North Korea's. The ones who gave up Gaddafi, he got killed. The one who had his destroyed and everyone lived with the fiction it was still there because it was useful in order to invade the country, got executed. Iran is the one that no one really knows whether it has one, though IAEA says it doesn't, and that's the issue we're dealing with. The one that has survived and has been dealt with at least a bit more respectfully is the one that actually has nuclear weapons, and that's North Korea. So if that's the lesson you want countries like Iran to draw, it's not a very good one, because it means you're incentivizing them to actually have the weapon rather than being suspected of having it, because that's the most dangerous phase in which people entertain the idea that they can attack you in order to stop the bomb. So that's one issue. The other issue, can the Israelis do it? That's, in my opinion, very useful political fiction. What the Israelis can do is they can attack Iran's nuclear program, but they do not have the military capacity, unless they want to leave their own airspace totally open to anyone, to industrially demolish Iran's nuclear program. So in a sense, what they're saying is we can attack Iran, provoke Iran to attack us, at which point there isn't a politician in DC who is not going to come running with all that Pentagon has to defend Israel. So Israel can, yes, attack Iran's program. It cannot destroy it, but it can entice the US to go in and do it. And I think there are those politicians in the US who would like that, and there are those who are very much keenly aware of the danger of that happening.
Thank you. If I may ask one last question, and this is from another good friend, Professor Shahram Akbarzadeh at Deakin University in Australia. Shahram says, you noted that there may be a mismatch between Iran's expectations of what Russia and China can do for Iran, and to what extent Moscow and Beijing are prepared to advocate for Iran. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, I mean, I think to some degree, the Russians and somewhat less the Chinese have been more open to the Iranian line of argument throughout the negotiations before, at least, before Iran signed the deal and now is deviating from it. So that's one issue. But I think more importantly, domestically in Iran, China has become this kind of on the other side of the rainbow, which is somehow magically going to solve all of Iran's economic problems. And this is, of course, partly ideological. That is, those who have always said the Europeans are spineless, which they partly are, and there's no point in negotiating with them because they will never do anything the Americans don't agree to, and we can't get the Americans to agree anything, or we don't want to agree with the Americans because we are revolutionary, etc., etc. They will say then, let's turn eastwards, let's turn to China. And you could say, to some degree, they are right in their assessment of the European weakness, and they're right in the assessment that China is on the rise in every sense, and therefore you have to take China on its own rather than seeing it as a corollary to the Western world. But there is a huge discrepancy between seeing those things and saying, if we turn eastwards, everything we need economically is going to be solved through cooperation with China. That's partly because the Chinese economy isn't, as perfectly functioning as people tend to think, nor is its political system as easy to navigate. And without that, getting its economy right isn't going to work. Nor is it the case that China is going to go out on a limb for Iran. It never has. China's relationship with Iran has always, like the European one, for instance, been a function of its relationship with Washington. Because there is simply no comparison between the two. The weight of Iran is nothing compared to the weight of the United States. Now, you can say that whenever China is miffed, as it were, with DC, it moves closer to Iran. But that does not the strategic alliance make, nor does a memorandum of understanding, which is what this 20, 30-year-old thing that they signed, that's all it is. It's a memorandum of understanding. In golden letters, probably, but that's all it is. For it to transpire into a much bigger economic exchange, which is also to Iran's advantage, rather than just becoming a kind of a consumer of Chinese products, requires a totally different Iranian economic setup. The Chinese aren't simply going to buy this very strange Iranian banking system where no one really knows where the money comes from. They might not necessarily require FATF standards, but they're not going to buy it just because the Iranians say that it's okay. Also, very, very crassly, why would you put all your eggs in one basket? And the Chinese basket is huge. Iran is just a couple of eggs, and Iran does not have a negotiating position vis-a-vis China if it has said to the rest of the world, we don't care about you. So for all those reasons, Iran needs to balance China. Not ignore it, but balance it. Doesn't mean that you have to have the same level of relationship with Europe or the US. That might be unrealistic or undesirable, but you cannot claim that just by looking eastwards, all of your problems are somehow magically resolved.
Perfect. Thank you so very much. You've given us a very incisive analysis of a very complicated and ongoing issue. We're most grateful. My sincere thanks to you, Rouzbeh.
Thank you.
Really terrific analysis. And my thanks also to our audiences around the world and also to my colleagues who have worked behind the scenes in making our event today possible, including especially our translator, and my colleagues in the audiovisual department. Thank you again, and a good day to all.
Thank you.